Hello, everyone. So my plan is to use the handout the extended handout that's on Moodle, um, to use as a base for what will be, I guess, a sort of lecture uh, on the topic of the metaphysics of time. So I'll basically talk through the handout, hopefully elaborate a bit, especially on difficult points, in an effort to make them clearer. The handout, together with hopefully this lecture, and the readings on the topics of the metaphysics of time, will provide you with a solid grounding in the topic. So, uh, to, for the most part, we so far in this sort of interrupted course, we've focused on space and then latterly the nature of space time. So, thinking about the relation of time to space and the integration of time within special relativity theory. Um, Now we're going to focus more on time specifically in its own right. And in order to do that, we're going to examine, to start with, one of the most famous philosophical arguments, and certainly I think the most influential philosophical argument that's been advanced concerning the nature of metaphysics of time, um, which is due to McTaggart. And we'll see that actually McTaggart's thinking and arguments, although generally they're rejected, have nevertheless helped to frame a lot of the debate on philosophy of time since, because different people disagree on which part of McTaggart's argument ought to be rejected, and that's come to define a lot of interesting positions in time. So, why focus specifically on time rather than just talking about space time? Well, one reason is that time seems to have some interesting features that the spatial dimensions lack, right? So it's not just another. Seems like it's not just another dimension, right? So a dimension that happens to be labeled T in Minkowski space-time diagrams. Um, it seems to have sort of rather different features from the three spatial dimensions. So, specifically, we normally think of time as directed. So we think that there's an asymmetry between past and future. We'll talk more about what that asymmetry might amount to. In the way in which there aren't sort of analogous spatial asymmetries. So the difference between, I don't know, up and down, according to one spatial dimension. There's nothing, doesn't seem to be anything really metaphysically fundamental about it. It's sort of arbitrary relative to a point of reference, such as the Earth. We might define up and down relative to our position on the Earth. It might be that there are differences between what lies above me to what lies below me, but that all looks very contingent, just to do with the contingent arrangement of matter. Whereas you might think there's something more metaphysically fundamental about the difference between future and past, and that's something we'll come back to. Another difference is that time, at least to many people, seems or is reasonably thought to have a flow to it. So we often speak of the passage of time or the flow of time. you might hear analogies drawn between time and a river or something like that, which also seems to have a flow to it. Um, Whereas there doesn't seem to be any obvious analogous flow to the spatial dimensions. So it's a sort of bit weird to talk about the flow of space or something like that. So again, this suggests that there might be something metaphysically interesting, maybe physically interesting, about the time dimension that just doesn't straightforwardly apply to three spatial dimensions. So questions that have been asked by philosophers and that we'll touch upon are: what accounts for the apparent asymmetry of time? What, if anything, accounts for that? What, if anything, accounts for the apparent flow of time? Or is the flow of time just something like an illusion? What exists in time? So, do only present things exist, or do future and past events and objects exist? And these are some of the questions we'll touch upon. But first, we'll focus on McTaggart. So, McTaggart, I suppose, his argument is one that naturally has drawn a lot of attention, and actually continues to, despite the fact that it was published over 100 years ago. And partly that's because of the very surprising conclusion that McTaggart draws. McTaggart argues that time is unreal. Now, that's weird. We'll see a bit more about what it means. And as I say, most people probably have rejected it, but they do so in interestingly different ways. So, McTaggart starts off by claiming that events in time, or moments in time. So you can think of a moment in time. I suppose, especially if you think time's absolute, it might be like a particular position in space, or a space-time point or something. But a sort of, I suppose you might think about a moment in time as a sort of point along the t dimension. So that's what a moment is. An event is a sort of thing that might occupy a moment in time, or might have parts that occupy moments in time. So, for instance, regular events like a football match might occupy multiple moments of time, might be extended in time. Maybe they have a part corresponding to each moment in time. So McTaggart claims that events can be distinguished in two different ways as they exist in time. So the first is that events can be distinguished according to what he calls their A properties. So A and B are just labels, not quite boring labels, but they're just the labels McTaggart gives to these things. They're arbitrary labels. So the A properties, he says, are properties like being past, being present, being future, as well as more specific properties like being 2 days past, being 20 years future. So we can distinguish events according to those properties. So one difference between, I suppose, Henry VIII and Prince William's great-great-grandchildren is that one lies in the past, whereas the other lies in the future, or something like that. Another way we can distinguish them is according to what he calls their B relations. So B relations are relations like is earlier than, is later than, is simultaneous with, is during, and also more specific ones like is 2 days prior to, is 30 years posterior to, and so on. So, for instance, we, as well as saying Henry VIII is in the past, whereas William's great-great-grandchildren are in the future. We presumably can say that Henry VIII is earlier than the. I mean, I guess these are objects. I should talk about their lives, maybe, because those would be things that were events. So the life of Henry VIII is not only past, but it's earlier than the lives of Prince William's great-great-grandchildren. Okay, so we have these two sort of ways of distinguishing events in time according to A properties and according to B relations. Now, McTaggart points out that B relations are permanent, right? So if one event is earlier than another, so for instance, the First World War is earlier than the Second World War, then it's always the case. Excuse me. It's always the case that the first event is earlier than the second. So if it's true at one time that the First World War is earlier than the Second World War, then it's always going to be the case that the First World War is earlier than the Second World War. A properties are different. They're impermanent. So something that was once future, at a certain point of time, the First World War was future. Then it became present, and then it became past. So these A properties, unlike the B relations, seem to change. Okay. Now, McTaggart points out that corresponding to the A properties and B relations of events, there are two ways in which we can order events in time, or think about them being ordered in time. So we can think about them being ordered in terms of their A properties. So, for instance, how distantly past they are, whether they're present, how distantly future they are. Or we can think about them as being ordered according to their B relations. So the idea is we'd order events in this series, which he's calling the B series as opposed to the A series, according to whether that event was earlier than or later than others, and how much earlier it was or later it was than others. Now, these sort of two ways of ordering are presumed to be equivalent, right? So I guess the most distant past events come earlier than all of the subsequent ones. So the A series is going to wind up producing the same order as the B series, but it's just two ways of thinking about that order. Okay, so McTaggart's argument, McTaggart draws upon this notion of the A series, that is the way of ordering events according to the A properties, and the B series, that is the way of ordering events in time according to their B relations, in giving his argument that time in fact doesn't exist. So how does McTaggart's argument go? Well, it's laid out on the handout, and the first premise is that there can be no time without change. So McTaggart thinks that change is essential to time. We'll go into this premise shortly and think about why one might believe premise one. Secondly, he argues that the A series or the A properties are necessary for change. So they're essential if there's going to be change. He then says that the A series is contradictory, and he draws from the premise 3, the premise that the A series is contradictory, the intermediate conclusional lemma that the A series doesn't exist. And, that seems, if premise 3 is true, then it seems that this intermediate conclusion that I've labelled lemma 1 must be true, right? So it doesn't seem that anything that's contradictory could exist. He then draws another intermediate conclusion, which is that there's no change, right? So he said that the A series is necessary for change, which is premise 2, and he says that the A series doesn't exist. But if the A series doesn't exist, and yet the A series is necessary for change, then it seems that there can't be any change. So that's the intermediate conclusion, or lemma 2, and follows from premise 2 and lemma 1. And then the overall conclusion of the argument is that time doesn't exist. And this follows from lemma 2, namely that there's no change, together with premise 1, which says that there can be no time without change. So premise 1, there can't be time without change. We've inferred already that there is no change, so it seems to follow logically, deductively, that time doesn't exist. Now, it seems that this is a valid argument. So by valid, I mean in the narrow philosopher's sense that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. So the conclusion deductively follows from the premises. Saying that an argument is valid doesn't imply anything in this sense about whether the premises are in fact true, and many people would argue that one or more of the premises is false. But if we grant the premises, it seems difficult to avoid the conclusion. It seems that the argument's valid. So what's McTaggart's justification for the premises? Well, when it comes to premise 1, there can't be any time without change. He thinks it's more or less self-evident. So he thinks that a universe with nothing at all that changed would be a timeless universe. Now, I suppose you could sort of try to get a grip on this, I suppose, by trying to imagine a universe where nothing changed. And you might sort of think, well, you could kind of imagine that. See, you sort of, I suppose, if I try to do it at least, I sort of imagine myself staring out at a scene, maybe a vast scene of galaxies and so on, in which nothing changes, right? So there's I don't observe anything to change at all, and maybe I'm viewing this and getting increasingly bored because nothing's going on to interest me. Now I might think, well, okay, yeah, so some time's elapsing, nothing's changing. That seems possible, but what's really going on there is I'm sort of supposing that my mental states are changing. So, I'm looking out at this scene, thinking about it, getting increasingly bored. And so we at least still have some change in this universe. But if I sort of try to imagine a genuinely changeless universe where no physical object is changing, no mental state of any observer or anything is changing, then maybe this becomes increasingly hard. So this is the sort of motivation that McTaggart has for premise 1. Many people accept that there couldn't be time without change, but it's definitely not completely uncontroversial. So if you're interested in the debate about that premise, then the papers by Shoemaker and Le Poitvin on the further reading list for this topic. Shoemaker argues that there can be, in fact, be time without change. Le Poitvin is a response to Shoemaker. But let's grant it for the sake of argument. What about premise 2? Premise 2 is the A series is necessary for change. So McTaggart does provide an extended justification for this. The justification is that the B relations are, as he's observed, permanent and unchanging. So if World War One's earlier than World War Two, then it's always earlier than World War Two. There's no point in time at which that temporal ordering reverses or something like that. So he thinks it's only the A properties that could change, right? So it's the properties of pastness, presentness, futurity are the sorts of things that can change the A properties. Now you might think that you don't actually need the A properties for change, because you might think that regular properties can change. So you might say, well, look, an apple could go from being green to being red to being brown as it ages. Um, so basically, it's changing in its color properties, not these fancy A properties of pastness, presentness, futurity. But the response that McTaggart will make to this would be to say that this change in regular properties is in fact nothing more than a change in A properties. So, in other words, what he'd say is that the green state of the apple goes from being present to past, the red state of the apple goes from being future to present to past, and the brown state of the apple goes from being future to present, and so on. So, basically, in order to understand change in ordinary properties, he will think, or he will claim, that we have to appeal to A properties. So, what makes an object change in its ordinary properties is that the state of its exhibiting those ordinary properties changes from whether it's past, present, or future. Okay, so this premise that the A properties are necessary for change is definitely controversial, in spite of what McTaggart says. And what we'll see is that it's rejected by a sort of school or tradition of philosophers of time who have become known as B theorists, right? B theorists normally agree with McTaggart that the A series doesn't exist or it's problematic. But they reject McTaggart's conclusion that time doesn't exist, and that's because they reject his premise that the A series is necessary for change. They claim that, in fact, the B series is sufficient on its own for change in time. What about premise 3? So the A series is contradictory. So McTaggart, in order to justify this, says, well, the A properties of pastness, presentness, and futureness or futurity are incompatible, right? So nothing can be past, present, and future. But to suppose that the A series exists is to suppose that every event has all of them. So the First World War has the property of being past, being present, and being future, which is contradictory. So supposing that events have A properties and stand in the A series, because it implies that these events have all of the A properties, results in a contradiction. So anything that results in a contradiction can't be true. So there can't really be A properties in an A series. And given that these A properties are necessary for change and change is necessary for time, he thinks that time is unreal. Okay. I should caveat that, right? So I suppose if there's a first or last moment in time, there may be sort of events that occur at the first moment of the universe only have the properties of being present and past, and never have the property of being future, whereas events at the last moment of time have the properties of being future and present, but never the property of being past. But it seems that any event in the A series has at least two of the three broad A properties. Now, you might think that, look, McTaggart's just made a mistake here, a basic mistake here, and actually the A series isn't contradictory at all, or at least he hasn't shown it to be. McTaggart anticipates that the reader might think that he's made a mistake here, and he talks about the natural objection that the reader might have. Right, so the natural objection to his claim that the A series is contradictory is to point out that it's just not true that any event has two or more of the A properties at the same time, right? So what would be contradictory is for the First World War, say, to be past, present, and future at the same time, right? You can't have all those properties at once. But of course, no one wants to say, no one claims that they have all of these properties at once, right? So what it would be natural to say is that the First World War had the property of being future prior to 1914. It had the property of being present during the years 1914 to 1918, and it has had the property of being past subsequent to 1918. So there's no contradiction, right? It's perfectly coherent that something that was future should now be present and should be going to be past. That's the natural objection. The contradiction would only be in supposing an event has all of these properties simultaneously. Now, McTaggart anticipates this and responds that actually the natural objection involves a vicious circle or a regress, in that it presupposes the existence of time in order to explain the compatibility of the A properties. So the idea is that we need to presuppose time if we're going to say that actually there's no contradiction because the First World War doesn't have the properties of past, present, and futureness at the same time. It's when we say at the same time that we presuppose the existence of time. And we might say in the past it was future and then present, and now it is past. But again, we're talking about past and what's true past and what's true now. So we're presupposing these A properties, he would say. We're presupposing the property of being past when we explain how it could be that the World War I was future and present. And we're presupposing the property of presentness when we say, well, it's now the case the First World War was past. So he thinks we're off on something like a vicious circle or a vicious regress in having to presuppose time and therefore the A series in order to explain how the A series is not contradictory. So McTaggart thinks that there's sort of no refuge from this apparent problem with the A series. Now, not everyone's convinced still. So, in particular, theorists who are now known as A-theorists reject McTaggart's premise 3. They reject the idea that the A series involves a contradiction, and hence they reject McTaggart's argument that time is unreal. So A theorists normally believe that, well, they do believe that there are A properties, and normally they would take those A properties to be necessary for change and therefore time. Now, okay, so how do they resist McTaggart's response to the natural objection? So how do they resist this claim that when we try and explain the coherence of the A properties, we have to fall back on appeal to time itself or the A properties themselves, and so we're off on a vicious circle or a vicious regress or something similar. Well, a reasonable response that they might appeal to is to say something like the A properties in the A series are something like basic or primitive and can't be explained in terms of or reduced to anything else. So they might say it's just a brute fact that it's consistent for an event to be present, to be going to be past, and to have been future. And you can't explain this consistency in other terms. So this seems a kind of a reasonable point. So if you're going to take the A properties to be basic, then it's quite natural to think that you're not going to be able to explain them without appealing to those very properties themselves. So in other words, explain them in other terms. For instance, I mean, by analogy, suppose that we take space to be basic. It's going to be very difficult to explain what space is without appealing to that very notion. And the same applies to things like causation and other philosophically interesting notions. So some people think these can be reduced to other things, but many people think that they're somehow irreducible. And so the best they can do in giving an account of these things is giving a non-reductive account. So they might explain some causal relations in terms of other causal relations or something like that. But you can never get away from that concept of causation if you think that that's a basic notion. So there's a sort of there's a position you can take, namely that these are primitive. That doesn't make it that surprising that you can't explain these in other terms. And the fact that you can't explain them in other terms doesn't necessarily mean that a notion is incoherent, as McTaggart seems to be claiming, but just that it's basic, right? You can't define it away in terms of something else. Okay, but let's return for now to McTaggart's argument. So he thinks, obviously, that change is needed for time. The A series is needed for change. The A series is incoherent, so the A series doesn't exist. Therefore, there's no change. Therefore, there's no time. Now, actually, because McTaggart thinks that the A series doesn't exist, he also thinks that the B series doesn't exist either. So why is that? Obviously, this is going to be a claim that's rejected by B theorists who themselves believe in the existence of the B series but normally reject the A series. McTaggart's claim is that we need the A series to make sense of the distinction between earlier than and later than. So this is the B relations. So, for instance, it's only by supposing that E is present but F is past, or E is future but F is present, or E is future but F is past, and so on, that we can make sense of E being later than F, and likewise for F's being earlier than E. So he thinks it's only in terms of they're having different properties of pastness and presentness that we can make sense, or futurity, that we can make sense of the notions of earlier than and later than. But, as I said, the B theorist will contest this, and we'll come back to that. Okay. Now, what does McTaggart exactly... So, McTaggart's concluded that time is unreal, but it's worth being sort of a bit careful about exactly what he means by that. What he takes his argument to show, in other words, and what he doesn't take it to show. So what he doesn't take it to show is that there's no fourth dimension, right? So nothing that we could label t, I suppose, in a space-time diagram. What he does take it to show is that this fourth dimension doesn't have the characteristics that would make it something that we could properly call a temporal dimension. So it's kind of more analogous to a spatial dimension, if anything, rather than a distinctively temporal dimension. And that's because there's a lack of change. So there's no real passage or maybe direction of time. So McTaggart does indeed seem to think that there is a fourth dimension, so he calls this the C series. So essentially that's what's left of the B series when we do away with the distinctions of past and future, right? So once we get rid of the A series, this undermines the B series, but there's some sort of residue left of the B series. So the C series, basically it has there's an order to it, but there's no kind of direction, right? There's no past future distinction, and therefore no earlier than later than distinction. So for instance, the natural numbers 1, 2, 3 and so on have an order, but there's no real privileged direction in which they're ordered. I'll explain this in a second. So yeah, I mean, so consider. So we might try to make sense of this ordering in terms of a betweenness relation when it comes to this C series or this fourth dimension. So one thing we could say is we could appeal to a notion of betweenness that doesn't suppose an earlier than or later than distinction. For instance, one might say that World War II is between World War One and the Vietnam War in this fourth dimension, just as we can appeal to betweenness when distinguishing points in space. So we could say something like London is between Paris and Edinburgh. I mean, that might not be exactly true, but we could do that in a more precise way. So the analogy is supposed to be that we could appeal to betweenness. So World War II is between World War One and the Vietnam War. And also, for instance, World War One is between the American Civil War and World War Two, and this doing this sort of thing gives us an ordering. So we have the ordering could be American Civil War, World War One, World War Two, Vietnam War. So in this ordering, World War One and World War Two lie between the American Civil War and the Vietnam War. World War One lies between World War II and the American Civil War, and World War II lies between World War One and the Vietnam War. But notice that we don't have an asymmetry here in the sense of a sort of privileged earlier than and later than distinction. So there's nothing to privilege this ordering: American Civil War, World War One, World War Two, Vietnam War, over the one that sort of goes in reverse: Vietnam War, World War II, World War One, American Civil War. Right. So just as when we appeal to betweenness to order Edinburgh, London, and Paris, there's nothing privileged to an ordering that says something like Paris, London, Edinburgh, from one that says Edinburgh, London, Paris. There's no sort of sense in which Edinburgh is prior to Paris objectively, or Paris is prior to Edinburgh. All we have is this sort of symmetric ordering. And so the claim would be that this goes to the fourth dimension too. Okay. So McTaggart still, I think, has a bit of explaining to do. So even if we accept all of this, we might say, well, look, we experience the passage of time, we experience change. So how does he account for that if there is no change and if there is no time? Now, McTaggart's basically going to argue that time and change, passage of time and change, are in fact illusory. So he does this by arguing that our impressions of time actually just couldn't correspond to anything objective. So there must be something wrong with them. They must be illusory. So specifically, he appeals to the fact or the notion of the experiential present. That is the set of all things that are experienced by an individual as being present. Now, it's well known from psychological experimentation, and I guess even was reasonably well known in McTaggart's time, that the experiential present isn't an instant, but rather an interval. So, for instance, you can do psychological experiments where a sound or two sounds are emitted from the same at the same distance from an agent, and they're not absolutely simultaneous, but rather one is emitted slightly before the other, and nevertheless the agent will experience them as being simultaneous, so they're present at the same time. There's even experiments that show that in some cases you can actually get the agent's experiences of the sounds to be reversed from what we might want to say they objectively are in time. So the earlier one is experienced as later and vice versa, and that's even though they're emitted at the same distance from the agent. There's also empirical psychological evidence of time dilation or psychological time dilation and contraction, not to be confused with the special relativistic phenomenon. Basically, you can sort of most of us have had some sort of experience of this. So time seems to pass very slowly when you're bored, maybe, but it also seems to pass slowly when you're in danger. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but somehow you sort of perceive a higher resolution or something when you're in danger. So it seems as though that time seems to you that time slows down. And we've all heard the sort of folk expressions like "time flies when you're having fun," but there is actually sort of serious psychological research that shows that we're subject to these temporal illusions. Now, so McTaggart basically takes phenomena like this and says, look, what reason do we have to believe in a flow of time and something like an objective present if there's just no systematic relation between this and the experiential present, what we experience as present, or the flow that we seem to experience. So he thinks that the only real reason we could have for believing in an objective present and an objective flow is because of our experience, which seems to be of a present and a flow. But actually, this experience couldn't represent anything objective, so there's no reason to believe it in the objective phenomenon. Now, of course, you sort of might try to resist McTaggart's argument. So you might think that, well, these psychological experiments actually sort of presuppose an objective present, an objective flow of time. So, for instance, in describing the one involving the sounds, I said, well, the sounds are emitted at the same time, at different times, one earlier than the other, but are either experienced by the agent as simultaneous, so as co-present, or it's the case that the earlier ones experienced by the agent as later than the later one. So in saying things like that, I'm kind of falling back upon the sort of notions of presentness and pastness, or at least the B relations of earlier than and later than, that McTaggart is trying to reject. So in general, in explaining how people are subject to temporal illusions, we're sort of falling back on the idea that there's an objective passage of time that they're somehow misrepresenting. So you might sort of think that even this talk of illusions presupposes an objective passage of time. So McTaggart can't escape that easily. Okay. In any case, so most philosophers, as I've suggested, think that there's something wrong with McTaggart's argument. So hardly anyone wants to accept that time isn't real, even in McTaggart's sense, in which there's perhaps a fourth dimension, but it just isn't distinctively a temporal dimension. Now, since we've seen McTaggart's argument appears to be valid, these philosophers have got to reject one of its premises, and philosophers are divided over which to reject. So we've already seen that A-theorists tend to reject, or do reject, premise 3. So they reject the idea that the A-series is incoherent. They accept the existence of A properties, and they think that events change with respect to these A properties, and that this change in A properties corresponds to the passage of time, which they take to be a real objective feature of the world that's not illusory. And normally they'll take the A properties to be primitive. You can't reduce them to anything else. And this, as I said, allows them to escape something like the natural objection that McTaggart's response to the natural objection that it's circular. On the other hand, B theorists reject the A series, but they think that actually you don't need the A series to make sense of the B series, and they will normally think that the B properties alone are enough for change and therefore time. So they reject premise 2 of McTaggart's arguments. So some of them also reject premise 1, so they actually don't think you need genuine change for time. So B theorists. So I suppose one question is, how do you make sense of the relationships of earlier than and later than if you don't have the A properties? So A is earlier than B if, for instance, A is in the past and B is in the future, where as A is later than B if, for instance, A is in the future and B is in the past. So how can we make sense of later than and earlier than if we don't avail ourselves in that way of the distinctions of past, presentness and futureness, the A properties, in other words? Well, I mean, basically the sort of strategy that's often appealed to is a strategy that gives a notion in which the temporal dimension is asymmetric, but doesn't rely on the A series to give that asymmetry. So one of the most well-known accounts of the direction of time, or the asymmetry of time, appeals to a notion of entropy increase, associated with the second law of thermodynamics. So the idea is, so entropy is a measure of, roughly speaking, a measure of disorder. If you're interested in this, by the way, you can look at the, I think it's the second last topic on Moodle. There's some readings on the direction of time, or it might be the last. I think it's the last topic, actually. But you'll be able to find them fairly straightforwardly, readings on the direction of time. Okay, so if you believe in this sort of reduction of the direction of time to entropy increase, or in other words, disorder increase, then you can just say that, well, the earlier times are the ones where disorder is lower, or entropy is lower, and the later times are the one where entropy is higher, or disorder is higher. And so you can make sense of earlier than and later than without actually having to invoke pastness, presentness, and futureness. So that's a sort of thing that move that the B theorist is liable to make. We'll talk more about this when we talk about time travel, because that's our next topic. Okay. Anyhow, so that's the sort of B theorist approach. Now, although they reject the idea that there are kind of A properties of pastness, presentness, and futureness, they still want to kind of make sense of our usual ways of speaking. So our usual ways of speaking invoke things like, we talk about the past, or we talk in tensed ways. We said World War happened. We don't say it's happening. Or we say that we will go to the supermarket tomorrow. Again, a future tense statement. So they want to make sense of this sort of apparent talk as though there are A properties without actually invoking A properties. And so actually what they'll do is they'll try and reduce this talk to B relations. So this is this point here on the handout. So they take this sort of talk to be a kind of indexical talk. So it's analogous to spatial expressions like here or 1 mile away. So whether it's true that Bloomsbury is here, when someone says that, depends upon the person's relation to Bloomsbury at the time of utterance, and whether it's true when someone says the BT Tower is 1 mile away. It depends upon the location of the speaker at the time of utterance again. So the B theorist's idea is that analogously, a statement like World War II is past actually is sensitive to the location in the B series that the speaker occupies, or that the speaker's utterance of the sentence occupies. So when they say World War II is past, that's going to be true if World War II bears the earlier than relation, that is a B relation, to their utterance of the sentence World War II is past. And likewise, when I say that 2021 is future, then according to the B theorist, that's going to be true because my utterance of that sentence bears the relation, the B relation of being earlier than to the year 2021. So you could say they offer a reduction of tense to B relations, or they offer a reduction of talk about A properties to B relations. So they want to make sense of our talk without saying literally there are A properties. Okay, so what? Okay, so that's the A theorem, the B theory outlined. But what do we think about them? So which is preferable, if either? So A theorists will normally argue that their theory does a better job of accounting for the passage of time or for change. They'll argue kind of in a McTaggartian way that really the B series doesn't provide enough for time because the B relations are permanent, so then they're unchanging. So just because one state of the world is earlier than another state of the world doesn't really give a sense in which the first state of the world changes into the second state of the world, because this is just a permanent relation of earlier than. Whereas if we say that the earliest state goes from being present to past, or future to present to past, then this provides a genuine sense in which there's change in the world. So you consider the apple example that we used earlier. So its green state is earlier than its red state is earlier than its brown state, but this doesn't really provide a sense of change. At least the A theorist will say so, because it's always the case that the brown state is the green state is earlier than the red state is earlier than the brown state. What we'd actually need in order for genuine change, they claim, is for the green state to be present and then past, and for the red state to be future, then present, then past, and for the brown state to be future, then present, then past. And that will give us genuine change. So that's an objection. The B theorists might, so that they'll normally try to respond to this. They might say such things as, well, we talk about rivers changing over their course. Now, maybe a river's a bad example because there is a sense in which a river flows, but like time flows, that's an analogy that's used, but it is only an analogy. But we might say, for instance, that the river changes from being narrow to wide. So it might be narrow near its source and wide at its mouth. And yet we don't need to appeal to anything analogous to an A property in order to make sense of what it is for the river to change over its course. It's changing over its course is just a matter of its having one property at one point on its course, namely narrowness, and another point at another point of its course, namely wideness. And likewise, the B theorist might say, well, what it is for instance, the apple to change is just for it to have one property, the property of greenness, at an earlier point than its property of redness. So they'll say that's just what change is, just like change for the river. Whereas the A theorist will say, well, this isn't enough for real change, right? The river isn't really changing; it's just in a sort of figurative sense that it changes. And they'll say that the B theorist has only really provided a figurative sense in which the apple changes. But there are objections to the A theory too. So one might wonder about whether you can really make sense of the passage of time, right? So according to the a theorist, time genuinely passes, and that's marked by the transition of events from future to present to past. But can we really make sense of the notion of time passing? So one might say, well, if time passes, then it surely follows logically that there's a rate at which it passes. But then, is it really coherent to speak of a rate at which time passes, right? What would we say? It passes at 1 hour an hour, second to second. This doesn't really seem to make clear sense, or it doesn't really sort of seem to be meaningful talk. Now, if you were genuinely to make sense of the rate at which time passes, you might need an external reference point, maybe a second stream of time with which to measure the first stream of time. Just like if you wanted to measure the amount of time it takes for a clock to register a change of a minute, it seems that you need a second clock. And well, you might be skeptical that there's a second stream of time to make sense of the notion of passage in the first stream of time. Another objection to the A theory, and this is one it's worth, maybe if you're interested, especially if you're thinking of writing an essay on this topic, it's also worth taking a look at the readings for next week's topic and the handout that I've put on Moodle there. It is because there's sort of an objection to the A theory from the special theory of relativity. So the problem for the A theorist is that the present, so they believe there's such a thing as a present, and the objective present is supposed to correspond to a set of points in space-time that are all simultaneous, right? What else could we mean by the objective present if it's not a set of points in space-time that are simultaneous? But the trouble is that, as we've seen in special relativity, Minkowski space-time, really there's no unanimity on simultaneity. So in particular, simultaneity is relative to a choice of reference frame, which corresponds to a position and a velocity, or a velocity of an observer. So okay, I think we can just, we can get a grip on the notion of simultaneity being reference frame relative, but does it really make sense to talk about presentness being reference frame relative? Certainly it seems that the A theorist might have to concede that in light of the special theory of relativity. So I mean, the sort of problem is that it kind of now looks perspectival, exactly what's present, what's past, and what's future. It looks relativized to a reference frame. And you might wonder whether this can be sort of reconciled with the view that there are kind of fundamental facts about what's present, past, and future. Next week's handout contains some more elaboration, or the next topic's handout, I should say, about this issue, so it's worth a read. Okay, so the A theory and the B theory, which we've looked at so far, can be thought of as different theories of the nature of time. There's also an interestingly different, in some senses related debate in metaphysics about what exists in time. And the main positions there are known as presentism, eternalism, and the growing universe theory. Now, presentism is the thesis that only temporally present objects, events, and times exist, right? So, according to the presentist, Aristotle doesn't exist, World War One doesn't exist, and the year 2018 doesn't exist because these are all past objects, events, or times. Also, according to the presentist, my grandchildren, the year 2020, the 2021, or the inauguration of the 46th President of the United States don't exist. And that's because they're future objects, events, or times. So eternalism, by contrast, thinks that, or claims that, present and future objects, events, and times exist just as present objects, events, and times exist. So all of those things that I mentioned exist. So Aristotle exists, my grandchildren exist, and presuming I will have some. And the inauguration of the 46th President of the United States exists, so that these things all exist just as present objects and events exist. So the eternalist conceives of reality as a kind of four-dimensional space-time structure, sometimes referred to as the block universe. So you might think actually Minkowski space-time representations lend themselves to a kind of eternalist picture, although it's not absolutely clear that we can really just read facts about what exists off some representation of space-time, right? So that's actually a philosophical move. But you might think that sort of somehow eternalism naturally complements present physicalist present thinking in physics about space and time. We'll go into that in a moment. The growing universe theory is a third major theory on what exists in time, and it's sort of a halfway house between presentism and eternalism. So, according to the growing universe theorist, the past and present exist, but the future doesn't exist. Correspondingly, past and present objects and events exist, but the future objects and events don't exist. So the Big Bang, Aristotle, and so on exist. This again should say on the handout the year 2021, my grandchildren, and so on don't exist. So the growing universe theorist again regards the universe as four-dimensional space-time structure, but it's sort of, to speak a bit figuratively, it's not as big as the one that the eternalist believes in, because it doesn't include the future. So it's a structure that increases in size as more things come into existence. In other words, as time passes, so more stuff is in the past. So why would you be a growing universe theorist? Well, one, or probably the main motivation, is that we sort of have an intuition that the past is settled while the future is open. So the growing universe theorist accommodates this intuition by saying that the past is settled in the sense that it exists, whereas the future is open in the sense that it doesn't yet exist. Okay, so let's go into a bit more the sort of motivation and the evaluation of these various positions about what exists in time. So Um, Now you might say, well, look, eternalism sounds very weird, and to some extent the grown universe theorist does, because it just sounds very weird to say things like dinosaurs exist. Um, that applies. The grown universe theorist has to say that just as well as the eternalist because they're committed to the existence of past objects. Um, Note that saying dinosaurs exist is equivalent to saying there are some dinosaurs. Now that's weird, right? It's weird to say that there are some dinosaurs. If someone said it to you, I think you'd probably think what they said was false, and maybe a bit crazy. Um, uh, Likewise, the eternalist seems committed to saying that uh, my grandchildren exist, or there are some people who are my grandchildren, which is logically equivalent. And yet, I deny that I have grandchildren. So these seem to be weird and counterintuitive consequences. Now, the eternalist and the growing universe theorist, fortunately, have responses to this, and they argue that the apparent oddity of these claims have to do with what's known as quantifier restriction, domain restriction. Some of you, those of you who've done first order logic, will have hopefully come across this. So the analogy that they might give is as follows. Suppose that I'm driving around a full car park. Been driving around for 10 minutes. Can't find a space anywhere. And my passenger says to me, there's a free parking space. Now, I'd be like, oh, all excited. Where's the free parking space? And suppose they said, well, there's this car park. Suppose I've been driving around a car park in London. They're like, well, there's a car park in Paris that's got a space free. Look, I just Googled it. Presumably, I'm not going to be very impressed by that statement, right? And in fact, their initial statement that there's a free parking space sounded quite wrong, even though there's a sense in which they're right, that is, somewhere in all of reality, there's indeed a free parking space. So, what's going on in this parking space example is that there's a variability in what's known as quantifier restriction. So the natural way of understanding my passenger's claim that there's a free parking space is a claim about things in this car park, right? So a claim that there's a free parking space in this car park. In other words, their existential claim, there exists or there is a free parking space, is naturally understood by me or interpreted by me to be restricted to the domain of things in the car park. Relative to that restricted domain, their claim is false. However, relative to an entirely unrestricted domain, the domain of all things that exist in reality and not just this car park, their claim's true. So the eternalist and the growing universe theorist are going to make an analogous appeal to quantifier restriction, and they'll say that the claim that there are dinosaurs, or there are some dinosaurs, and likewise, more generally, claims that there exist past objects and events, and in the case of the eternalist, that there are future objects and events, are true relative to a totally unrestricted domain of quantification. So when I say there are dinosaurs, that's true relative to a completely unrestricted domain. But the reason it sounds odd is because normally someone who hears me say that will interpret me as making a claim about some more restricted domain. For instance, the domain of objects that exist in the present rather than throughout all of reality. So, in other words, when I say there are dinosaurs, or there are some dinosaurs, um, I might be naturally interpreted as meaning there are some dinosaurs that exist in there are some dinosaurs in the present, which of course is false. But they'll say all they mean is that um, there are dinosaurs is true relative to the most unrestricted domain. In other words, what there is in all of reality. Okay, so that's a discussion about eternalism. What about the growing universe theorists? So we've seen one advantage is that they provide a sense in which the past is settled and the future is open, and often we think about the universe in this way. But the growing universe theorist has some problems too, and actually, one of them, or maybe the key one, is very similar to an objection to the A theory, which is that so the A theory seems to want to account for the passage of time, or seems to imply there exists a passage of time, and then it makes sense, if time genuinely passes, to ask what rate it passes at, but there seems to be no sensible answer to that question. Likewise, with the growing universe theorist, if the universe is growing, we might think it seems that it's sensible to ask what rate it's growing at. But all the answers to that look kind of absurd, and so maybe makes the question absurd. And given that the growing universe theorist seems to suggest that question's legitimate, maybe it casts doubt on the growing universe theory. So we might say, well, what rate could the universe possibly be growing at? An hour per hour, a trillion objects an hour? It seems, those answers seem weird. But moreover, there's another objection related, which is that if the growing universe theorist is going to talk about the rate of growth, then they're going to have to appeal to the passage of time. So they're going to have to say something like an hour per hour or a trillion objects per hour. But that, I suppose, undermines one seeming virtue of the growing universe theorist, which was that we might have hoped that it would provide an account of the passage of time in terms of the growth of the universe. So we might have hoped that, if we're going to appeal to this notion of the growth of the universe, then maybe we can understand the passage of time in terms of the universe's growth. But this actually might look circular if we then have to appeal again to the passage of time in order to explain the rate of the universe's growth. So at best, I suppose at worst, the problem is that if the universe is growing, then it should make sense for there to be a rate at which it's growing, and that it doesn't really make sense because answers like an hour per hour or a trillion objects per hour aren't really sensical. At best, the objection is just that one advantage or apparent advantage to the growing universe theory, namely that it seemed able to provide an account of the passage of time, is actually undercut because we need an answer to this question. What rate is it growing at? And in order to account for what rate it's growing at, we need to appeal in a sort of circular manner to the passage of time. Okay, what about presentism? So I think presentism maybe has some sort of intuitive pull. Um, so uh, you, you might think that there's a sort of beyond the point about the weirdness of saying there are some dinosaurs, and beyond the eternalist defense against that worry. You might think there just is some intuitive sense in which the dinosaurs have gone out of existence, right? So they just don't exist anymore. And you might think even more so, there's maybe an intuitive sense in which uh, my grandchildren don't exist. They don't exist yet, and they're not part of reality, right? So you might sort of want to sort of dig your heels in against the eternalist and say, look, they really are not part of reality, right? It might have been that they were part of reality, or they will be part of reality, but they're just not part of reality as it is. Um, so that's part of the appeal, but there are also worries about presentism. So there are a few. We'll go through three key ones. So there's an objection about causation. So consider the claim Trump's election victory caused him to be US president. That seems like a plausible claim. But the trouble is that Trump's election victory was in the past. So according to the presentist, it doesn't exist. But you might say, well, how could an event that doesn't exist cause one that does, namely his currently being president? It doesn't seem to make any sense to talk about events that don't exist causing ones that do. In a similar vein, there's an objection to do with language, an objection from reference. So it seems that I can refer to non-present objects like Shakespeare. So I might say Shakespeare is a playwright, and I normally think I'm referring to somebody when I say Shakespeare is a playwright, namely Shakespeare. But you might wonder how I can refer to objects that don't exist. So this is sort of difficult. So you might think, well, there's a sense in which I can refer to fictional objects that don't exist, maybe unicorns, maybe Harry Potter, maybe Father Christmas. But the story about how I refer to them, or in what sense I refer to them, might be sort of complex and a bit controversial. So it might we might think there are sort of fictional entities that you can refer to. We might think that you don't literally refer to an entity, but you sort of refer to some feature of a fiction. Now, okay, so you might be able to give some story about how you refer to sort of some non-existent, namely fictional entities. But would we want to reduce our account of how we refer to Shakespeare to the same thing as how we refer to Father Christmas? It seems that there's a greater reality, we might say, to Shakespeare than Father Christmas, and maybe our story about reference should be the same, and maybe that sort of pushes in that sort of maybe pushes in the direction of eternalism. So we might think the way in which I refer to Shakespeare is more like the way in which I refer to Queen Elizabeth II than it is like the way I refer to Father Christmas. Now, finally, and again, it'll be worth for those interested, particularly those writing on this topic, to take a look at some of the details from next week on the extended handouts and the reading, because there's a sort of objection from the special theory of relativity, which again is developed in more detail in the next topic's reading. Um, and obviously kind of interesting in light of the themes of the course. And the issue is that it seems that there's a tension between presentism and the special theory of relativity in a way analogous to the sense in which there's a tension maybe between the A theory and the special theory of relativity. So the A theory, of course, says that there's a property of presentness, an objective property. But what is it for a set of points in space-time to be present? Well, it's presumably, at least they have to all be simultaneous. And they also have this property of being present. Now, the trouble was that simultaneity is relative to a reference frame, and so, in other words, a velocity, according to the special theory of relativity. So it becomes difficult to make sense of an absolute notion of presentness. Now, this problem is potentially even deeper for the presentist than it is for the atheist. And the reason is that the presentist thinks that what's present is what's real, whereas the atheist doesn't necessarily have to deny that non-present objects exist, but merely say that present objects have a special property of presentness. But if you say that what's real, what exists, is what's present, and yet what's present is relative to a velocity, then does that mean that we have to say that what's real is relative to a velocity? Now, that's quite peculiar, and would give a sense in which maybe what's real for me traveling at one velocity is different from what's real for you traveling at a different velocity. And we might really wonder about the coherence of this notion of reality for me or reality for you. In any case, there's certainly a challenge for the presentist in trying to give a coherent picture of what it is they're claiming is real, that's compatible with the relativity of simultaneity and therefore relativity of presentness that the special theory of relativity seems to imply. So as I say, if you'd like more details on that, then it's well worth taking a look at some of next week's readings and also the handout for that. Okay. But we will leave it there. And I'm sorry this hasn't been as enjoyable as hopefully a seminar would be, because, for instance, it hasn't allowed for Q&A or any sort of discussion. But hopefully you got something out of it. And as I say, between the handout, my discussion, and the readings that are on Moodle, you'll be in pretty good shape if you've read through all of those. Okay, thank you, and I will produce another one of these for the next week's topic. So have fun and stay healthy.